is brain power. And just to explain to you how it came about, I was asked to write a tips booklet for new teachers, 12 things that every teacher should know. And I sort of started with, I just sort of jotted down ideas, started with learning styles and so forth. And this 12-point tips booklet turned into a 71,000-word book, and which is going up on Kindle, and I'm also going to do a printed version. But it's available now. You can download it as a PDF. And the website is brain-power. I've written it up there, but I don't know if you can see it. Brain-power, brain-power.co.uk. BESIG 2013. And the username you need, if you want to download it, is BESIG 2013. And the password is my name, Rita Baker. But it is all case sensitive, so you have to observe the capitals and the lowercase letters, okay? But you're very welcome to download it from that website. And I would be very, very grateful for any feedback, because I've proofed it as much as I can. I've asked various people to proof it, but I'm sure, sod's law, whoops, shouldn't use that language when I'm being filmed. I'm sure there are some other inconsistencies, so if you care to download it and let me have your comments, that would be great. Okay, I will just say that I've always been interested in how the brain works, and I know that when I did my initial teacher training, my sort of proper training, 1971, we did lots of educational psychology. Nobody mentioned anything about the brain because nobody really knew much about it. And to be honest, we're still discovering all the time. But there's a lot of information out there which I think we should know, not just as trainers. I just think as people we ought to know some of this stuff. So the way I've written this book, it's an idiot's guide, but I'm not assuming you are idiots. I'm the idiot, okay? What happened was, as I began to write it, I began to ask myself questions which needed answering. And so I basically relied on the internet. I just looked at all sorts of sources, collated the information, simplified it till I could understand it, and then I hope I've presented it in a way that's understandable to other people. If there are any expert neuroscientists here, you're going to find it a very boring book. But anyway, so that's enough about it. So I'm going to start off by just asking you, and you can work in pairs or threes or rows, whatever you like, what do you know about the brain, and what do you know about the divisions of the brain? So this is just to find out who I'm working with, you see? Okay, please go. I never know when's a good point to stop people, but I've asked you very kindly not to look on the second page, actually it's the third page, but you are allowed to look on pages 4 and 5. And this is designed for jotting down notes. And so working cooperatively, just record anything that you think you might otherwise forget. But otherwise don't bother with notes, because if you're interested any further, you can read the book. So what have people come up with for the key divisions of the brain? Any volunteers? I heard Akosh saying something.
No, I just said neuroscience is your choice.
Okay. What do you know about the divisions of the brain? Most people know something about it. Any volunteers?
Left and right.
Left and right. Okay. So left and right, from the back, left and right. What is the differentiation between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere?
Left is logical things.
Left is logical, is linear, is sequential, is mathematical, is verbal. It's a very crude division. And the right is big picture, creative, often associated with emotion. But I mean, they're not completely divided. They of course, they interconnect. But because people often get described as left brain people or right brain people, which is absolutely daft, because if we only had one hemisphere, we'd be severely challenged. So, of course, we all use both hemispheres. But some people do have natural preferences, and of course that has implications for training. So there's the left-right division. What are the other divisions that... Can you still hear me at the back?
Yeah.
Good, thanks. What are the other divisions, the key divisions? Anybody? Yeah.
Reptile brain and the cortex, the neocortex. Great.
So we've got... Believe me, I am no expert, okay? But as I understand it, we've got the brain stem, which is connected to the spinal cord, through which we have a network which connects with the whole body. You could say the brain inhabits the whole body, actually. Then from the spinal cord, or the brain stem, also known as the reptilian or the primitive brain, because we share it with reptiles. It tells us if we're cold, it tells us if we're hungry. It deals with all the basic survival signals and appetites. And then, in the center, we've got what's known as the emotional brain. And then surrounding that, like a helmet, is what's known as the neocortex. So, and then at the very back, here, you've got the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is to do with gross motor coordination. It's the sports brain, if you like. So you've got the brain stem, which is the primitive brain, which is the basic survival brain. You've got the cerebellum, which is at the back here. That's your sports brain. In the middle, you've got your emotional brain, and surrounding that, the cerebral cortex, or the neocortex, is your intellectual brain. That's your thinking brain. Now, obviously, it isn't that simple, but they are clearly definable divisions of the brain. So, the first thing I want you to look at on page 1, I hope you all have access. You've all got access to this, page 1. Okay, so on each side of the brain, the cortex is divided into lobes, and these lobes are specialized. So if we look at the frontal lobe, you got it? The frontal lobe is divided again, and obviously, and again and again and again. But these are the major. This is as deep as I'm going. Okay. So the frontal lobe, you've got the prefrontal cortex, the motor association cortex, and the primary motor cortex, and Broca's area. Could I ask you to just look at that, please? If necessary, read it out. If you can't all. If don't all have a copy in front of you, could somebody read out to the others what it says about the frontal lobe? Could you do that now? I don't know if you can see it up there. So would anybody care to summarize the main focus of the frontal lobe? What would you not be able to do if you damaged your frontal lobe? Yeah. Think. Although it seems we think not just with our whole brain, but we actually think with our whole body, which I can't go into in detail in this session, but it is absolutely fascinating. Our brain is not just isolated inside our skull. This is the major thing I've come to understand. And that the fact that within the primary motor cortex division, you've got kind of a map. So on the left-hand side, you've got a map of the right side of the body. And in the right-hand side, you've got a map of the left side of the body. So in fact, the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body and vice versa. And this is why some of the most usual things that people have done for centuries, like country dancing, you'll often find it's very synchronized. You go to the left and then you go to the right. It balances up all the time and you cross over and this sort of... It is so good for the brain. And there's a body of... You've probably heard of brain gym, have you? Kinesiology. And what that focuses on is actually making sure that the left and right brain are properly synced. It might sound silly, but I found from experience it really works. Have you come across a thing called lazy 8s? If somebody's having difficulty concentrating, you get them to, with their eyes, you form an 8. So but you have to go up. So up and round and up and round, but you have to follow your finger. And then you do it with the other hand. And it's a very, very focusing activity. And what it's doing is exactly that. It's balancing up the left and the right. And at the beginning of my career, I used to work as an advisory teacher, working for children with learning difficulties. And one of the biggest difficulties they had was what was known as cross-laterality, where they might be left-hand dominant, right eye dominant, and they didn't know which foot they could kick to football with. And this is some of the stuff we used to do with them to balance them up. We're not surgeons, but actually by taking on the responsibility of being a trainer, interacting with people, we're messing with their brains. We are messing with their brains, so we might as well accept that and make sure that we're messing appropriately. Okay. So if you look at, I don't know how to pronounce this, but parietal or parietal, I haven't a clue, the next lobe. And thinking that all these lobes are in the cerebral cortex, the parietal or parietal, does anybody know how it's pronounced?
Parietal.
Parietal, thank you. The parietal lobe, what other part of the brain do you think it particularly has to connect to? It does, but it's the movement. So the cerebellum that I put down there is not actually a lobe. That is the sports part of the brain. And I think actually this might be a bit confusing. Everything except the cerebellum is a division of the cortex, but the cerebellum isn't actually a separate part of the brain. That's the sports, that's the gross motor part of the brain. And obviously it has to work pretty closely with the parietal lobe. But I'll come back to that. Then going to the, is it occipital? Because most of this I only read, you see, and it's only now I'm doing this workshop, I'm thinking, flip, I don't really know how to pronounce this lot. Okay, so the occipital lobes are to do with vision. Not just vision, but stimuli and complexity of input. And then moving on to the temporal lobes, which are basically to do with our hearing. But it's not just hearing sound, it's recognizing, it's processing, it's detecting the quality. And then you've got these two black dots. So in the frontal lobe, that black dot is Broca's area. And that's a really important thing. It's concerned with speech production, so this is where it becomes relevant to us. Yeah. And Wernicke's area, which is sort of really at the conjunction of the temporal, parietal and occipital lobes. And that's related to understanding language. And the interesting thing is both of those usually only occur in the left hemisphere, although some people are wired up differently and it apparently can be located in the right hemisphere, but it's usually only in one hemisphere. And you know, when somebody has a stroke affecting the left side of their brain, it will tend to paralyze the right side of the body and they'll lose their language. If it's the right side of the brain, it'll tend to paralyze the left side of the body, but their speech may remain intact. So, and I think that was one of the observations that led to this kind of examination and research. So I won't spend any longer on those because you can actually read it for yourselves. But I have a question for you. Do you think the structure of the brain is hierarchical or democratic? Anybody got any ideas? I suppose it could be. But interestingly enough, it used to be assumed that it was hierarchical, that the thinking bit's the real bit, you know? And so people who are good at thinking, people who are academic, you know, they're the tops. And then the primitive bit, well, wow, it's primitive. But if you can't breathe and sleep and eat, then it really doesn't matter what shape your cortex is. It's absolutely useless. But it's also a very recent discovery that in fact the brain is so networked, it's so interlinked, it's a network of networks, that actually any incoming information is diffused right across the brain. It's not up and down. It's sort of, it's from nucleus to nucleus really, and I'm going to look at that in a little more detail because as I examined the brain, as I did my little bit of amateur research, it occurred to me that the brain is just a model for everything. It's a model for society, it's a model for the way we teach, it's a model for the universe. It's not me saying this. In my book I quote the person who said it. But have you know what I mean by fractal? That actually, if you look around in nature, if you look at the brain, it's definitely fractal. It's sort of mirrors of mirrors of mirrors of mirrors within mirrors. And it seems the whole of the universe is actually organized in that way. So my contention is, if we're not working in the way that the brain works, then it's not surprising that stuff ain't working. Okay? So that most of us are used to a hierarchical organisation, but it seems that's not what makes the brain happy. And if you are interested, I've developed that argument much further in the book, because it just, everything I read seemed to point to that we have to look at the brain as a model, and then we have to organise everything we do in line with this, because it is just the most perfect model. And we're sort of a lot of what we do, a lot of what we're trained to do, is counterintuitive. And not to get sort of too waylaid, but it seems that the most creative, some Harvard Business School students and some kindergarten children were all asked to decide what you could do with a paperclip. Who came up as the most creative?
Children.
The kindergarten kids wiped the Harvard business students off the floor. And subsequent experiments showed that what happens is we are born totally creative, receptive, and very intelligent. And then we go to school, and we are slowly destroyed. And I think, possibly in our profession, we are less destructive than most. I really feel, as a TEFL person, I think we've been ahead of the game for quite a long time, but maybe haven't moved on fast enough in recent years. But this is a personal observation. The thing I found working with children with so-called learning difficulties, they actually turned out to be some of the most brilliant children I'd ever worked with. The learning difficulty was with the organisation within which they were being taught, most of the time. But although the brain is divided into sort of the eye area and the hearing area, if you like, you can transfer something you learn through one modality, you can transfer it to another. So just to give you an example, I was working, there was a totally mad woman. One of the maddest people I ever met. She ran a clinic for dyslexic children, and I thought, this woman is insane. But as an advisory teacher, I was supposed to go and check her out. And she had all these kids crawling around the floor. These are children challenged with reading, right? Crawling around the floor. And it was her contention that one of the reasons they couldn't read was because they'd never learned to crawl. So I thought, yeah, right. But anyway, they learnt to crawl, they learnt to roll over, because to crawl and to roll over, I don't know if you've ever thought about it, try it when you go to rooms tonight. If you lie on your back and then roll over, just analyse what you have to do to execute that, what you do with your arms and so forth. So these kids were learning basic coordination. After 3 months, she took them back to reading, and they were all fine. I mean, she had to sort of implement certain techniques, but they were fine. And I think this worked because of two reasons. I think she was right. They did lack coordination. But as we'll come on to in a minute, she took the pressure off them. And she said, we're not going to do, because the thing is, if you're bad at something, the last thing you want to do is more of it. So if you want to get better at something you're not good at, you have to find some pleasure in it and some reason for wanting to do it. So we'll come back to that. So what division of the brain is key to the formation of memory? What is, if you didn't have this part of your brain, think of people with dementia. What part of your brain is key to storing of memory? Any ideas? Yeah? No, it's involved, but it's not key. It's actually, if you now may turn over. You've been awfully good. I'm very proud of you. If you look at the emotional, it's what we call the emotional brain, the bit in the center. Now, what I'd like you to do is very briefly tell each other your earliest memory, the earliest memory in your life. Could you do that? Right, sorry to interrupt you, because you could probably spend all evening now reminiscing, and I think somebody, and I'm so transparent, aren't I? We all are. Somebody said, she's going to say, well, that's related to emotion, isn't it? Has anybody got a memory, an early memory that isn't either associated to emotion or something sensory, like a smell or a sound or a... Has anybody got a memory that's just purely intellectual? Yes?
My memory is just red bag because it was so red. My grandmother's red bags.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's visual,
sensory,
it's probably
visual.
tactile, yeah. Yeah?
Yeah, with my grandmother, I used to eat those biscuits in
Yes.
London with sugar on top, with all the different colors. And
You know, it's fascinating. It's often something very, very simple like that. You know, biscuits I used to have with my granny. You know, and it's something so grounding, and I'm glad. I'm in a little bit of panic because I thought maybe somebody will disprove this. But it does seem that our earliest, our most enduring memories are related to emotion and the senses. How much of our training is related to that? Okay, I'm just throwing it in the air. I don't want any answers. Okay, so I'd like you to look at the hippocampus. Can you locate it? This isn't how you're supposed to do it, but this is a very crude drawing of mine. It's a synthesis of lots of diagrams that I saw on the web and thought, oh, I can't cope with this. So I simplified it down to the point where it made some sense to me. And it sort of looks like that, the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is absolutely key. We as trainers, we need to really bear this in mind. And I'm speaking to myself here, and I'll explain why. The hippocampus receives and encodes sensory input. But it can only hold a limited amount of it as short-term memory. So if you think of the hippocampus as a beaker, all new experience, information, everything, well, not all, because we'll be coming to that, but it takes in a lot of information, and when it's full, and the rest is lost. And what you have to do with that information is to pass it into long-term memory. And this is something that is absolutely crucial to us as trainers. How do we get input to be transferred into long-term memory? Now, the long-term memory is stored in the cortex. So the person who said that the front part of your brain is key to memory, yes, it is, because we store our long-term memory in the cortex. But that's only after we've transferred it from short-term memory, and that's where the hippocampus is absolutely essential. So if you think of the hippocampus as a beaker, I try to do that now with my students. I sort of think, are their beakers full now? Because I know my own personal weaknesses, because our students are only with us for such a short time. I want to give them everything, And I have to hold back and think, you know, less is more. Focus, rather like we looked at in the previous workshop, defining the purpose of your presentation in 15 words. What are the essentials that I want to get across on this training course? What are the things I absolutely have to embed, and what are the things that aren't so important, because no participant can take in everything. And I know this is my biggest failure. I come out of every session going, you know what? I gave them too much. So I think a lot of us, because for the best of reasons, we want to give them value, we want to help them progress and so forth, it's all too easy to give them too much input. And also, we all know that last-minute learning is ineffective, don't we? If you've ever crammed for an exam, you might remember it for the next morning, and you might sort of vomit it all onto the paper. And after that, it's gone, isn't it? That's not learning. That's passing exams. And unfortunately, I know in Britain particularly, that is how our children are so-called educated. And for those of you who are Brits, and I think it's true in the States as well, and I don't know about other countries in Europe, but our education system had moved to a much more project-based way of learning, and now our latest education minister, whose name I cannot mention without being rude, so I'm not going to say it, has decided everything will be done by examination, which means they'll do what I know I did, stuff I wasn't very interested in. I just remembered the dates and the facts, spewed it out, got my O-level and passed on. That is not what we're about. Okay. Now, so for learning to be really effective, but we know this, but this is why, this is the neurological reason why, for information to be returned, it needs to take place extensively in shorter, regularly repeated, manageable sessions with breaks in between. And the break in between is terribly important. This is why when you're learning something new, you will tend to sleep more. And it's why babies sleep so much. Because stuff passes from the hippocampus. Well, I'm saying this, but according to the sources I've looked at, stuff goes from the hippocampus to the cortex, either when your brain is in a rest state or when you're asleep. And so rest, you know, if you send people off for a coffee break and they come back 5 minutes late, it's not good from a management point of view, but actually it might not be that bad. So that's the hippocampus. Then the thalamus, or the thalamus, anybody got any views on how it's pronounced?
Thalamus.
Thalamus, thanks. Okay, we'll go with thalamus. Here, it's known as the brain's relay station, and again, it's terribly important because it sends on any sensory impulses from the hippocampus, which it perceives. I'm using the word perceives, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but it's the thalamus which kind of judges whether this information is worth sending on from the hippocampus. And what attracts it is things that are important or perceived to be important, interesting, amusing, or exciting. Then it'll get passed on. So our training, ideally, needs to be perceived to be important, interesting, amusing, and exciting. Okay? And now we're coming to a thing called the RAS, which is the reticular activating system. But just call it the RAS. And this is something we also need to be aware of as trainers. Anybody any idea what this is? The RAS, the reticular activating system. We've all got one, apparently. Yeah.
It's a bit like an antenna, and it picks up something that it's recognised, or the information input, and then it picks it out of the environment. That's why we see, when I was looking for a car, the only car I ever saw on the road was the car that I thought I wanted.
Exactly. Exactly. So, in fact, it's a series of neuronal circuits that can connect the brainstem to the cortex. So you could see it as a sort of load of pathways going through the emotional centre, from here through the emotional center into the cortex. And the example you gave is absolutely perfect. We probably think we notice most things, and we don't, and I'll give you a statistic for that. It is said that at any given moment, our brain, excuse me reading this, even though I wrote the book, I still haven't memorized it. At any given moment, our brains are exposed to around 2 million bits of information, of immediately available sensory data. I don't know how they measure it. Of which we process how much? Out of 2 million bits per second. 7. It seems. Now, what do we mean by data? Well, in this room, if you close your eyes, if everybody closes their eyes, women might do a bit better on this than men, but well, who's to tell? Have you noticed the colour of the carpet? Don't open your eyes.
Sorry?
Have you noticed what the person next to you is wearing? Have you recorded the temperature?
Cozy.
What are you hearing? I mean, I could go on and on, you can open your eyes now, but actually we're bombarded with information, and most of it we actually ignore unless the thalamus has been alerted and says, hey, this is interesting. So the example that Michelle gave, you buy a new car, and suddenly, well, would you believe it? Everybody's not only got the same model, it's the same colour, it's the same year. That's because we've picked it out, it's become relevant. I know when I was expecting our first child, I just thought, is there any woman on the planet who isn't pregnant right now? Yeah. So you can, mothers, you can all relate to that. So we pick up things that grab our attention for whatever reason. So again, this is something as trainers, this is why sometimes spontaneous training, and we were talking about it earlier, it's very noble to plan your training and execute it in the minutest detail, but it doesn't leave any room for the absurd. And sometimes a real mistake, I was going to use another word, just aware of that, a real mistake, you can actually use it to your advantage because it will be memorable. And very often you only remember when your teacher slipped on the banana skin, you know. But if you can link that to something more important, I really think it's not as important to be as prepared as we have to know where we're going, that's not the same thing. But I don't think we have to be sort of so controlling in what we do. We have to allow room for magic and spontaneity. That of our participants as well as ourselves. And if you stop for a joke which has got nothing to do with anything, that's fine. As long as you pull it back and use that to anchor the next thing. Now, I think there are probably some people in this room who can pronounce that guy's name for me?
High.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I won't attempt to emulate it because I need more practice. But anyway, this guy, could you shout it out again, please? Thanks. He defined, it was in 1956 he came up with this. I've told you a lie. Not 7 bits of information. He estimated or measured 126 bits of information out of 2 million per second is what we recall. What are the implications of this? If you want people to recall everything, you're going to have to cover it more than once, aren't you? And you've also got to highlight to people what it is you want them to get. Because you know this famous question, do you understand? Yeah, right, fine, super, move on. What is it that you understand. Because most people, some people may not understand and don't have the guts to say they don't understand. Others might think they've understood. They think they've understood what you meant them to understand, and you assume they've understood what you meant them to understand. So if you say, well, what is it that you understand? You sometimes get some very, very surprising responses. Yeah, I've done that. I've even asked somebody, so what was the focus of that lesson? And they come up with something, I think, my God, that was the last thing on my agenda, but fine. If that's what you thought you got, that's great. Or I'll ask about we ask about each other, you know, what did you do in so-and-so's session? And you come up with, you go and check with so-and-so, and so-and-so says, well, I didn't think that's what we were doing, but I suppose I can see why it was thought. Okay, so that's quite fun. So according to the study of this gentleman here, ordinary everyday tasks can take up to 1/3 of our capacity. So, for instance, of every 126 bits that we're capable of taking in, 1/3 of those will be to do with things we're having to do to survive, you know, just everyday stuff. So it doesn't leave much room for, you know, supposing that the 126 bits they get are not the bits you intended them to get, and this is what happens. It's not because you're a lousy trainer, it's not because they're a lousy participant, it's just there was a mismatch there because they weren't properly alerted to what it was you were trying to get across. And so hence the really important point, when we set out to run a session of any kind, which I didn't do here, you should outline where it is you're trying to go. I'm trying to decide that on the way through, okay? At the end, I'd be very grateful if you could feed back to me where you thought we went, okay? So, novel, unusual, amusing, even shocking, slightly bizarre incidents and experiences will engage the, I can't even remember the thing, the RAS, the reticular activating system. And it's all focused on the thalamus, which is the bit that picks up the exciting stuff from the hippocampus and decides what to pass on. Okay, how are we doing for time? We've got another 40 minutes, right? Does anybody need a breather, or can you stand this? Well, I guess you're breathing, so I'll carry on. How many kinds of memory are there? Now, this, I think, is really critical. Something that only when I started researching into this, I thought, crumbs, I have never, ever thought. Maybe I do engage all the kinds of memory, but I've never been consciously aware. Have you any idea how many kinds of memory there are? Well, that have been analysed anyway. Four. Has somebody read the notes? That's fine. Do you know, I found that's quite a good training technique. You put some information on a piece of paper that you want people to read. You say, don't read it. The thalamus goes, boy, doesn't want me to read this. Internalises it. So, yeah. Semantic memory, which you would think is the bit we deal with, right? Is the shortest term memory. And it requires maximum motivation. If you want to, for instance, if I wanted to learn to pronounce that name properly, I would have to ask you to repeat that several times. And then I'd have to repeat it. And then I'd have to see in the morning if I could still do it. I can't even spell it from visual memory. It's just one word, and I'm a linguist. But I would have difficulty recalling that. So semantic memory is estimated it lasts 15 seconds. And you can only normally retain between 5 to 9 bits of information, unless it's frequently repeated. Now, semantic memory is the one most of us are dealing with. So the implications of this are to enhance semantic memory, you've got to link it to something else. Now this is where the corpus callosum comes in. Now nobody mentioned that. Between connecting the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere is this bundle of nerves known as the corpus callosum. And bearing in mind the left brain is meant to process sequentially, and the right side of the brain is supposed to be big picture and random. It's very important when somebody says I'm a left brain learner or a right brain learner, we should all be a whole brain learner, a global brain learner. And we need to learn how to connect things up. So if you can engage in activities which, if you can devise activities which engage the left brain and the right brain equally, that's going to be the winner. So this is why, as we heard in the last workshop, stories, metaphors, parables, brilliant combination. Why? Stories are sequential. You have a beginning and an end. That's left brain. They are also, they can evoke emotion, they're creative, they're visual, they're imaginative. That's why stories, metaphors, mnemonics, that's why this stuff works. Because you are using both sides of the brain, and that's the most powerful combination. And if you think through history, pre-literate cultures, parables, I mean, how did all the great teachers teach? Through story, through metaphor. And was mentioned in the last workshop, I think when I started doing business English, I shied away from it because I thought, with business people, it's kind of dry, factual. Now, business people are people, as we all know, and I realised I'm a storyteller, and that I'm not just indulging myself. And even if I tell stories about my own experience, as long as they relate to what the students, participants, to their experience, and they can give back their stories too, it is memorable. And why do I find myself wanting to do it? Why do we find ourselves wanting to do it? Because that's the way our brains are charged, are programmed, and then we unlearn all this natural stuff. So it's really okay to tell jokes. Why do risque jokes work? Because they shock a little bit, you know? So, and then another important point about semantic memory is, like, you know, if you download a piece of software, it has to be installed before you can operate it, doesn't it? So if we teach somebody something, it has to be installed in the long-term memory before they can process it. You can't tell somebody something and then immediately ask them to operate with it. And I know I've done this in the past. You know, you explain something, I don't know, in the old days, you'd explain something about a tense and then immediately get them to do an exercise. It doesn't work. They've got to have really integrated it and experienced it. And a good way of checking this, I won't ask you to do it now, but think of a song you know very well. Or think of two songs you know very well. So you know the words and the music, and then try to sing the words of one song to the tune of another. Now you know both of these, but because you're having to do another layer of operation, you will fail. Or you'll find it, you might manage it, but it'll be a struggle. And so just because people actually have the information lodged in their brain, but we know this from experience, doesn't mean they can process it. So any activity we ask our participants to engage in, we have to analyze how many layers of process that involves. Because each time you add a layer of process, the task becomes less and less manageable. Now obviously the more advanced and the more people have integrated stuff, the more you can add the next layer. But I've seen with younger teachers, sometimes they ask their participants to do something which they think is quite simple, but when you analyze it, it's got 2 or 3 layers. And even though it's perceived to be simple, the students won't succeed, and self-esteem, of course, just takes a dip. So this is another thing to remember, how many layers of process are involved in the activity which you're asking them to engage in. Another one is, you give people 5 sentences, and you ask them to remember, 5 statements, and you ask them to remember them. And then from memory, you say, now, which of those were true and which of those were false? You'll find they can't remember 5 sentences anymore because they're having to process now which of those was true, which of those was false. They forget. They get 4 out of 5. It's very rare that they will get 5 out of 5. So these, and if you want to demonstrate this to your participants, because sometimes I think it's useful to tell the people we're working with why we're doing this. I know it's sort of, I think sometimes we tend to leave it as a mystery. I know my husband, when he was in the Navy, a friend of his got a report saying, people will follow this officer anywhere, but only out of curiosity. And, you know, are we asking our participants to stay with us out of curiosity? We do have to take them on board and tell them, I think it's quite okay to tell them quite clearly why we're doing this, and to help them to, you know, to give them examples that they can try out for themselves to understand why we're doing this. So with the semantic memory, link it to something else is one way of helping to retain it. I'll come back to that. You don't put too many layers of process. Don't teach people new vocabulary and then ask them to process it. Do that in separate stages. And it really, I take singing lessons, and my singing teacher has taught me the concept of singing something in. And that means, I mean, I used to think I'd do a new song every lesson. I can spend 3 months on one song, especially if I'm going to perform it, because I have to learn it to the stage where I cannot not sing it correctly. So if it's a kind of a high note that I'm a bit nervous about and think, oh God, I hope I get it on the night, I have to rehearse it so much that I just go in knowing I will get that note because my body will do that for me, because it is totally hardwired into my brain. I don't think we do enough of that with our, I mean, they're not all going to go and perform, but I don't think we automatically do enough of that in our language training. I've learned a lot from my singing teacher about how I should operate as a language trainer. So that's semantic memory. The next one is procedural memory, which is also known as motor, body, or kinesthetic memory. And you don't need any motivation for it, but you might need some practice to embed it. So it's like riding a bicycle. The mechanical aspect of playing a piano. I mean, you know, you get people who can play the piano perfectly, but they're not musicians. They're technicians, really. They know all the fingering, but the emotion's lacking. But so procedural memory is, it's sort of gross motor memory, I suppose. Now, some people, there are some approaches for trying to link the kinesthetic, if you like. You've probably heard of TPR, total physical response. Well, that's why it works. You're relating something semantic to something physical, and that's why it works, because you're supporting one memory with another. One memory is acting as a prompt to the other. And so total physical response is a way of linking procedural memory to semantic memory. And you've probably heard of, I mentioned it before, kinesiology as well. There are some trainers who actually use that quite a lot. Me personally, I don't like to be wedded to any one approach. I like to remain eclectic. I don't know if I'm being honest here and saying because I think it works, but or maybe I just get bored. But these are all sort of tools in our toolbox that we can pull out in certain contexts. Then you've got episodic memory, and that's effortless. I don't know how many people are as old as me, so you might not be able to answer this question. Does anybody remember hearing about the assassination of President Kennedy? There are one or two oldies, eh? I can remember, I was at boarding school, we were doing our prep, I can remember the table, I can remember the radio, I can remember the desk I was sitting at, I can remember what it felt like, I can remember the ink blots on that desk, I remember the radio, I remember the shock. And I don't have to make any effort to remember that. So that's an example of how something slightly shocking, because that attracts the thalamus, you see. So we can embed completely random things into our training. I mean, not everybody's an extrovert like that, but if you suddenly stood up and screamed and everybody said, what did you do that for? I just felt like it, but what were we doing when I did that? You know what I mean? It's a bit extreme, but okay. And does everybody remember what they were doing when they heard of the death of Princess Diana? Yes. Just amazing, worldwide, everybody just remembers that. So it's something that connects to the emotions, to the emotional centre. And then you've got reflexive memory, which is also known as synesthetic. And it's whole body, and it's things like phobias. You know, you see a spider, I don't, but I've got a daughter who's totally phobic about spiders. And so this is just to show how it is that we have, into our training, we have to bring not just this bit, but the physical and the emotional. It's all a necessary part of embedding memory. So can you think, just a quick buzz between you, can you think of ways in which the kind of training you do at the moment, ways in which you might adapt some of the activities to link up the different memories? So you've got the semantic, how to remember the words. You've got the procedural, it's we do it like this because it's automatic. The episodic, the shock or the surprise or the amusement bit. And the reflexive, which could be you take an oil, you know, you create, I mean, some people with Suggestipedia, they make lovely lavender smells, you know, okay, you're doing something you don't find very easy, but you happen to love the smell of lavender. So, okay, we're going to come, well, it might actually ruin your pleasure in lavender, but hopefully it will help to just change your response to this thing that you thought was hard. So can you just have a little think about some things you could do in your own training to network these memories? Okay, I'm going to stop you. So I draw a pause there, and I always feel bad interrupting something, because I've noticed in any workshop I've done, when people get the opportunity to talk to each other, they'd happily actually, there's so much to share. Most people would happily carry on for half an hour, and the presenter could actually go off. But the important thing is, once somebody's interest is hooked, it won't actually stop. So I've interrupted you now, but I think I flatter myself. You've engaged in it enough that you will actually want to, maybe this is just positive suggestion, I'm not, but you will actually want to carry on thinking about this. So I won't, you know, you can do it in the bath or whatever. So I'll carry on, but I do, and it's something I'm asking myself, because as a result of writing this book, I'm not saying I've got it right. As I wrote, I was going through thinking, oh my God, that's something else I'm not really doing, and so I'm reflecting on all this myself. And for me, this is a shared journey, and I don't know it. It's other people's stuff, but I'm trying to make some sense of it and apply it, because I do think it's helpful. So, what do you know about brain waves? Thank you so much for that. People sometimes get them, but that's an interesting observation, the way we use it. Oh, I've had a brainwave. The slowest brainwaves are delta waves, and I'm not a physicist here, but they sort of vibrate, or whatever they do, at the rate of 1 to 3 hertz. but that's the slowest. That's what kind of activity are you involved in when your brain waves? Oh, and another thing I learnt is different parts of the brain can be operating with different wavelengths. It doesn't mean your whole brain is in delta. Different parts can be pulsating or whatever it is, vibrating, whatever the brain is, at different rates. And that's something, just trying to think the source of that, but I found that very interesting indeed. But what would you be doing if your brain were totally in the delta state? Yeah. It's the body awareness will have closed down. So if you're not asleep, you'll not be aware of your body. And it's, well, so not something to be encouraged really, you know, or is it? Some people will induce that state because you don't always have to learn actively. We do need time to process. And some people will just naturally shut off because that's what the brain needs. And males will shut off more than females, but we'll come to that later. And girls, this isn't a feminist thing, it really isn't. It's quite interesting, and it's not to the detriment of males, it's just different. I'm one of those people who's realised there's a difference. Yeah. So it's during the state of delta that human growth hormone is released, apparently. Then the theta waves between 4 and 8, so they're a little bit more rapid. What do you think the brain's doing in that state?
I think it's a state which we cannot control consciously, at least unless we've been trained to do so.
Yeah, it's a dreamy state. It's bordering on drowsiness, and it's what we do when we're daydreaming. Now, I realise at school I must have spent half my school life in theta waves because I realised I was terribly bored by most of it, and my mind was anywhere except on one. But I always used to be criticised as a child for being a daydreamer, but I discovered one of my strengths is I'm a daydreamer. So it's just, there are times when you shouldn't be daydreaming. So you've got to have the right kind of consciousness for the right activity, but I would never ever discourage anybody from daydreaming unless they're operating machinery or something. And then apparently this state allows for the integration of experiences and can result in behavioural changes starting at the unconscious level. So that's what a hypnotist will be using. And it's what Suggestopedia uses. You've come across Suggestopedia. And real devotees of Suggestopedia will bring colour into their training, music into their training, smell into their training. And I have seen it work quite effectively, but it doesn't work if your participants aren't convinced by it. Because I went through a phase of thinking, oh yeah, this is the way to go. And I completely closed down a group of, because they just thought it was crap. And they just wouldn't let me continue long enough for them to discover that it possibly wasn't. But anyway, you know, so that's not a good way to use it, obviously. Then you've got the alpha waves, 9 to 13. The body is calm, slightly meditative, but not quite as deep as theta. But it's also used for super learning. So the theta and the alpha are kind of used to embed stuff through the subconscious. So almost bypassing the left side. The left side of the brain is known as the conscious brain, and the right side is sometimes called the unconscious brain. You're bypassing all the logic, you're bypassing all the but. And the thing is, children operate very much in the right brain. And it's the adults who introduce the buts, the what-ifs. Because, you know, the default position is we can do anything that we want to do, that we're prepared to learn, and then we're conditioned into the things that we can do and we can't do. And we're working with people who've been conditioned into what, you know, I'm not a language learner. Oh no? How did you learn your mother tongue? You know, what was the pathway to that? I mean, what training did you get for that? Well, I didn't. I picked it up. Didn't. Well, yeah. Okay. Think about it. Of course, you're a language learner. If you're a human being with an undamaged brain, you're a language learner. But how many of you get faced with people? Oh, I hated languages at school. I was no good at languages at school. So we're dealing with those kind of beliefs and values and conditionings all the time, and sometimes to use a more sort of meditative way, when you know a group very well, think, just listen to some music and I'm going to give you some positive ideas here. It might not be your thing. I do it sometimes, but not with everybody. And Baroque music is particularly good for inducing these kind of brainwaves, apparently. Then the beta waves are the ones, they're between 14 and 30, and that's what we would normally expect in a classroom as being normal. So in this state, a person is fully awake and alert and learns consciously. But a lot of what we learnt as children, we did not learn consciously. We didn't know that we were learning it. And is there not a place in our training rooms for both conscious and unconscious learning? Do we always want people to be in the conscious beta state? I'm not suggesting that. I'm just throwing that question out there. That can be 31 to 120. People can be defined flow state. Do you know that feeling when you're in flow? It's just really working for you. You're writing something, or you're just there. You don't have to concentrate. It's just working for you. And he describes flow state as a balance between stress and positive emotion. So there's enough stress, and stress isn't always a negative word. There's enough stress to present challenge, but not so much that it shuts you off, and that you're feeling good enough and relaxed. So you've got to be relaxed, if that makes sense. He sort of drew a diagonal up from a square saying one side is relaxed and the other side is stressed, and it's the balance point between the two. And I do now consciously, when I'm working with people, try to think, are they in flow? Or Buddhists would call it being in the moment. And that's directly related to brainwaves, that's flow state. The implications of that is, when we give people a task to do, it must be clearly structured and directed. But that doesn't mean controlled. Okay, it's a framework. They need clear structure and direction, clear set of goals. Don't have to be our goals, they can be their goals, or they can be a mixture of both. They have to understand how their progress will be measured. And I forget, I was having this conversation with somebody, and it was at this conference, but I don't remember where it was, saying that most of the time it's good to give feedback immediately unless it's interrupting some process that's going on. In which case you don't interrupt the flow, but you feed back afterwards while it's still relevant to what they've done. So to explain grammar as a separate, I mean, we all know this, to explain grammar as a separate activity is pointless. It's got to be pulled out from some kind of process or some kind of communication that they're undertaking. And the best point to feed it back is as soon as possible after they've either made the mistake or, and this is the bit that's easy, it's easiest for us to write down the mistakes, they've said something that is so inspiringly good that we ought to reinforce that and comment on it, and that's the bit I find I'm bad at. I can notice the mistakes, but I forget to say, actually that was a perfect example, that was just so natural, that was just... and that comes out of flow state, in the moment. And feedback, of course, can be either from the trainer or works better from another participant. I mean, research shows that if participants correct each other, it's more memorable than if the trainer does it. But of course, we have to set up the environment in which it is emotionally safe to do that. If you correct your boss, unless you have a really good relationship with that, we've had that sometimes, you know, so we have to manage that. But ideally, people learn from each other. We're just spinning the plates. You've probably you know the expression a more knowledgeable other? Well, two things that resonate with me. It's spiral learning. Much of language teaching is linear, as if there's a hierarchy, and this is my old hobby horse, you know, you teach tense by tense, preposition by preposition. A hole in your knowledge and the whole lot topples and collapses. Spiral means you keep revisiting, but each time you expand a little bit, and within the spiral, think of it as a snail, that each loop connects back to the previous loop. Then you've got watertight learning and training, and that was Brunner. That was Brunner's. I studied this when I did my PGCE, but I didn't understand it. Okay, spiral learning is how you do it, but I didn't understand effectively what that meant. And immediate feedback while people are really in the flow. If they're not in the flow, waste of time. Immediate feedback helps to consolidate that spiral, and repeated feedback. Now I've realised I've gone on a bit long, so I'm going to have to rush this a little bit, but it's all in that book if you want it. How does learning get hardwired? And that's the bit I really want to look at, because I find it so exciting. Can you find the structure of learning in that handout? And if I'm being a really good trainer, I tell everybody to jump up, and because I can see quite a lot of people yawning because it's very tiring and it's very warm. But it's only 10 more minutes, and then I'll let you go. Okay. We have neurons, which are the brain cells. Apparently, you get 100,000 neurons in the equivalent size of a grain of sugar. 10% of those neurons are sensory neurons. 10% are motor neurons, which also include mirror neurons, which I'm going to come back to. 80% are neurotransmitters. 80% of the cells in our brain are involved with forming connections, and their function is to detect pattern and to make meaning. Now, I've always had a thing about the way we disrupt, we just deconstruct the language in order to teach it, and we lose the pattern. And if anybody's interested in my workshop tomorrow, who hasn't been to my workshop before, I'll be touching on that. 80% of the brain is wired up, is organised to detect pattern and make meaning. Not have other people make the meaning for us. We have to discover our own meaning, and we have to see the pattern. Now, I think as trainers, we can help people to see the pattern. And we do them a great disservice by completely destroying the pattern, and a lot of language training is about completely disrupting the pattern. I'll leave it at that, but it's a really strong hobby horse of mine. Now, what happens is each time we learn something new, so each neuron, sort of, it's got two ends. When we learn something new, the neuron actually sends out a kind of branch, if you like, called an axon. And this can happen in seconds. And a baby is actually making thousands and thousands of connections a second. The brain is actually changing second by second. And each time we repeat that activity, we produce a chemical called myelin, which sort of surrounds that connection and hardwires it. That's why, in order to learn something, we have to repeat and repeat and repeat, and then repeat. And again, I know as a trainer, this is something I don't do enough, or I don't get my participants to do enough. to hardwire their learning. It's a chemical thing. And the more connections we create, you get things called synapses. So if you can imagine, you've got dendrites, these little connectors from one cell, connecting with, if you can imagine, this belongs to another cell. And you've got a chemical bridge across here. So when you make a connection, it's a little chemical bridge is formed. And the more we learn, the more connections we make, which is why, if you want to stop yourself getting Alzheimer's, learn something new. And the other thing is, don't be too stressed, because cortisol, which is a stress hormone, destroys the hippocampus, which, as I said at the beginning, is the bit that contains the short-term memory, which, if that is damaged, there's no way it's going to pass into long-term memory. So that's a really important thing. So some of the other questions I was going to ask you, you can actually access for yourselves if you're interested enough. The questions are, name some of the key hormones implicated in learning. Well, I'll tell you about one. The abbreviation is PEA. It's known as the ecstasy hormone. You find it in chocolate. And it's the kind of buzz you get when you achieve something. When you just feel, I have really learnt something, so that's something else we need to bear in mind. How big a buzz are people getting? Because when we learn something, we get a buzz. And serotonin, which is a dopamine, is an endorphin, a happy hormone. Serotonin, again, these are sort of stimulated by PEA, and happy hormones facilitate learning. And when you learn, you increase your happy hormones, so it's an upward spiral. And dopamine, which is also a happy hormone, which gives you a buzz from physical exercise. And we all know that physical exercise is good for people, which is why in the last hour and a half I really should have invited you lot to run around the room or something, because what I've done is actually quite cruel. The other question was, what are the 2 minutes, thank you. What are the 4 stages of learning? And I'll just summarize it very quickly. The basic stage is when information is absolute. Things are like that, things are as they are because that's how they are. The second one is some kind of comprehension developing. And you begin to realize there could be another point of view. The third stage, they're not distinct stages really, knowledge becomes increasingly relative. And at an advanced stage, you construct your own understanding through analysis, synthesis, evaluation, always remaining open to possibilities and always accepting that there might not be a black and white answer. And even if you don't know the answer, it doesn't mean the answer isn't out there. Now, I also think, although we're dealing with adults who one assumes are sort of educated and experienced, I have come across a lot of people who are not at that level, not just with language learning, but just the whole, when they're having a discussion or debate, very fixed mindset and very unopen. Now, if we're teaching negotiation skills and all that sort of thing, should we not be bearing in mind the 4 stages of learning and understanding and critical thinking? And then there is the question of emotional intelligence. But I won't go there. It's all a bit breathless, and as you can see, I'm passionate about it. I hope you are too. And I'm not trying to plug my book because the download is free, and I know it's not perfect, but if you're interested too, I've made it, I think, quite simple, and I've put in lots of stories and anecdotes. I'd be very happy if you would read it and communicate back to me. What you think's rubbish, what you think might be helpful, what you think might be added. and engage in the debate, and also encourage each other to apply it in our professional practice. Thank you very much.